right, so before you left school, we started reading the book Horizon by Scott Westerfield. Since it's been over a week now with reading this book, I'm just going to start over. We had already read 4 chapters. But if you already remember what happened in these past 4 chapters, you can skip this and just go right on to the next video. But for everyone else, I'm going to start at chapter 1. Chapter 1, Javi. Next question, Molly said. How many miles of wire are in this airplane? A lot. Put your brain to work, Perez. Estimate. Javier Perez sighed. If I get close, will you stop bugging me with these questions? Nope. You need the distraction. Molly clutched her book of airplane trivia and grinned. I've got at least 14 hours worth. Enough for the whole flight. You wanted to sit by her, Anna said from the row behind, and Oliver laughed beside her. Javi groaned, wishing the plane would take off so he could lean back and pretend to sleep. Telling Molly that he was afraid of flying had been a terrible idea, because that made it her job as team leader to distract him, with engineering problems, of course. At robotics club every afternoon, Molly always talked while she worked, explaining what she was doing, challenging others to do the same. For her, making robots wasn't just a hobby, it was a conversation. The funny thing was, the distraction was actually working. Once Javi's brain had latched onto her question, the plane became more than a huge unknown carrying him away from home for the first time ever. Now it was an engineering problem. How many miles of wire? Javi thought. The 4 members of Team Killbot, along with their advisor, Mr. Keating, were sitting in economy. Brooklyn Science and Tech had lots of rich people who donated money to the school, and when the team had qualified for the Robot Soccer World Championships, some billionaire had stepped up to pay travel costs. But first class to Japan for 5 people? Nobody had that much money to give away. Even so, this was what Mr. Keating called fancy economy, designed for 14-hour flights. Javi's seat was surrounded by buttons and lights and a video screen, all of which were connected to wires, right? He'd tested the buttons on his armrest. They controlled the angle of his seat, a reading light, the screen. There was a button for summoning the flight attendant, and a rocker switch with volume symbols. There was even a little remote control for games, which also seemed to be a phone, in case you needed to call someone from halfway across the Arctic Circle. Javi found himself wanting to strip it all down, to see those wires, motors, and gears out in the open. He'd been taking things apart as long as he could remember, starting when his mother had let him take apart their busted microwave when he was just 5 years old. He imagined the wires under the cabin floor, snaking up and around the curves of the chair, and another bright web above him, bringing power to all those lights and air blowers in the ceiling. Conjectures, Molly prompted. Conclusions? Javi's brain buzzed. Each seat would need at least 100 feet of wire, and there were about 500 people on the plane. That was 10 miles right there. On top of the ailerons and engines, the cockpit crammed with gauges, the extra wires needed for the huge business class seats a few rows ahead. Too much to calculate, so he multiplied his first guess by 10. In the whole plane, maybe 100 miles of wire? Not too bad. Molly waved her book. But it's more like 300, a technical tour de force. Okay, wow, Javi said, though amazement was the surest route to more trivia questions. It seems like a waste using a machine this complicated to fly our dinky little robots to Tokyo. The Killbots are not dinky, Molly said. They're the U.S. champions of robot soccer, junior division. Javi shrugged. May I remind you that the other team's robots got broken in shipping? We lucked into this. We would have won anyway. Molly's expression dared him to argue. Javi wasn't sure. He'd seen videos of the robots built by the unlucky finalists from New Mexico, scuttling 4-legged scorpions that whacked the soccer ball with their tails. In stark contrast, the Brooklyn Killbots were toasters on wheels, mindless bullies that swarmed the ball, knocking other players out of their way. Like how 5-year-olds play soccer, one of the judges had muttered in the semifinals. And there were, maybe 20 feet of wire in each killbot? Not exactly a technical tour de force. Last night, Javi's whole family had gathered for a send-off dinner. Uncles, aunts, and cousins all telling him how proud they were. His mother had told stories of him helping on her superintendent rounds when he was little, fixing locks and faucets at age 7. But for the whole dinner, he'd felt like a fraud. What kind of engineer was afraid to get on an airplane? Next question, Molly said. How many Aero Horizon flights have ever crashed? He stared at her. Was she just trolling him now? If building robots had taught Javi anything, it was that way too much could go wrong with machines. No matter how carefully he tested them, the killbots were always doing unpredictable stuff in the middle of a match. He thought about those 300 miles of wire in the airplane, the millions of rivets and seals and screws, the engines and tanks full of flammable fuel, all those parts that could break, warp, fail, or explode. I'm going to go with 2, he said hopefully. Nope, Molly said. 0. Really? Yep, no crashes in the whole fleet in 40 years. Huh. Javi felt a relieved smile reach his lips, and his irritation with Molly faded. Even when she was trolling him, she always had a plan. Thanks. She shrugged as if to say that his fears were forgotten. Just enjoy the flight, Perez. We're going to win for real this time. Javi gave her a fist to bump. Team Killbot. Mr. Keating leaned forward from the row behind. Guys, maybe no more discussion of airplane crashes. Actually, Molly said, we were discussing the total absence of airplane crashes. Still, Mr. Keating said firmly, some people are nervous about flying. Not us engineers, Molly smiled at Javi. Next question. Last question, Javi pleaded. Molly looked like she was about to argue, but then a ping went through the cabin, and a voice announced that the doors were closing. Javi swallowed. Last night, he had imagined himself jumping up and running off the plane when this moment came, but thanks to Molly's distractions, he was managing to sit here quietly. Fire away, he said. This is my favorite one. Molly clutched the trivia book close, guarding the answer. What do flight attendants call it when the oxygen masks drop down? Javi frowned. There's a name for that? It's secret flight attendant slang. Let me give you a hint. The oxygen sensor gets tripped, right? And suddenly all of those rubber masks fall out of the ceiling. Everyone's freaking out, screaming like animals. So what do flight attendants call it? A really bad day at work? Nope, Molly gave him a pleased smile. They call it a rubber jungle. Get it? Because everyone goes primal and there's all those masks hanging down like vines, and usually it's just an accident because of a broken sensor. Javi tried to smile back at her, but now he was thinking about those hundreds of masks up in the ceiling, each tightly wound in its little compartment, like snakes ready to spring out and start a panic. Just one more thing that could go wrong. Chapter 2. Yoshi. The kids a few rows back were talking about airplane crashes again. Yoshi Kimura could hear the girl closest to him even over the announcements. She kept sharing fascinating technical details about the plane. This was the problem with his mom buying his ticket so late. He'd been stuck only a few rows from the economy section. All those people who thought sitting in a tin can for 14 hours was exciting. Yoshi couldn't wait for the plane to take off, for the roar of its engines to drown out everyone's voices and leave him with his own glum thoughts. For the 100th time, he wondered what awaited him at the end of his flight. His father had promised a punishment as epic as it was long delayed, but he had left the details to Yoshi's imagination. An attendant appeared and said in careful English, "Would you like something to drink before takeoff, sir?" "Mizu no goshimasu," Yoshi replied, and was pleased when she looked surprised. Japanese people always thought he looked too Western, too much like a hafu, to speak in a flawless accent. But he'd lived his first 10 years in Tokyo before Mom had given up and moved back to New York. The attendant bowed, slipped away, and returned with a tiny bottle of water. Yoshi drained it in one gulp, but his throat stayed dry. The weird thing was, he'd been much calmer on his way here to New York 9 months ago. Even with a priceless 400-year-old sword in his baggage, stolen from his own father, he hadn't been worried. Of course, back then, he hadn't known he was breaking the law just by taking the family katana out of Japan. His father had always told Yoshi that it would be his one day, but had never mentioned that it was an official cultural property, a national treasure too precious to leave the country. The sword was in the hold of the airplane now, safely sheathed and in its travel case, and insured for $400,000, an amount that was somehow more impressive than words like cultural property. On the phone yesterday, Yoshi had asked his father what would happen if Japanese customs took a close look at it. Could they arrest him for bringing it back into the country? "You should have thought of that before you stole it," was all Father would say. Yoshi hadn't pointed out that the whole reason for taking the sword was so he'd never have to go back to Japan again. But that plan hadn't exactly worked, had it? The announcements finally ended, and soon the plane was rumbling down the runway, gaining speed and lifting into the air. It leaned into an unhurried turn as it climbed, slicing through the sky like a vast, graceful blade. When at last it reached straight and level flight, Yoshi reclined his seat all the way until it was as flat as a bed. He curled up under the blanket, wrapped in a noise-canceling headphones, staring at a tablet full of anime. He had to binge-watch everything now. His father was almost certainly going to take his screens away when he got to Tokyo. No computers, phones, or TV for a month had been Yoshi's punishment for failing a calligraphy test at age 9. Whatever his father had in mind now would be much worse than that had been and would last all summer, which meant disappearing from his New York's friends' lives. By September, everyone would have moved on to new shows, new music, new manga, and Yoshi would be forgotten. He'd be a foreign kid, starting all over again, just like 3 years ago when he'd first arrived. He would always be foreign, it seemed, always on the wrong side of the Pacific Ocean. The flight attendant came by and lightly touched his shoulder, probably to ask about dinner. Yoshi just shook his head, retreating further under the covers. He didn't want her to see that his eyes were glistening. He found himself hoping that the airplane never made it to Japan. Chapter 3. Molly. The white stretched out beneath Molly Davis in endless sheets. In some places the snow lay in waves like sand dunes carved smooth by the wind. In others ice rose up from colliding floes in jagged broken spires. The sun was just above the horizon and cast long shadows across rippling white. Molly shivered looking at all that ice. According to the flight tracker map on her video screen, the plane was well above the Arctic Circle now. No cities, no roads. She hadn't seen anything but Arctic white in ages. Which raised an interesting question. If Javi's worst fears came true and the plane crashed, would the passengers freeze to death before help arrived? Molly looked around the cabin. It was June, so nobody was wearing anything heavier than a sweater, and those flimsy airplane blankets wouldn't even keep you warm in a movie theater. Maybe you could make survival tents out of the life rafts pictured on the safety card. Or keep yourself warm with jet fuel? Was there a way to burn it steadily? Or would you just blow yourself up, along with what remained of the plane? She turned from the window to ask Javi for help with the problem, but he was still asleep. That was annoying. He'd been jittering like a bag of wind-up teeth all morning, but now that Molly was bored, he was unconscious. It was better than him sulking, she supposed. Ever since Team Killbot had won the championship by default, he'd acted like they weren't really winners, like they deserved for things to go wrong in Tokyo. Well, the other finalists' bad luck wasn't Team Killbot's fault. That's what you got for making fragile robots. You could ship the Killbots 1,000 miles in the back of a bouncy UPS truck, and they'd probably work just fine. They were simple, and they kicked butt. That was how good engineers built things. Molly looked back at Oliver and Anna, hoping that one of them was awake. Nope, they were asleep too. Even Mr. Keating was snoring. Turned out that 14 hours was a long time. Molly hated having no one to talk to. At home, when Mom got quiet, Molly sometimes even talked to herself, answering her own questions. Anything was better than silence. She looked down at the ice and shivered again. Hobby let out a sputtering snore, and Molly wondered if she should get some sleep too. Team Killbot's first match was the day after they landed, and she had no idea what jet lag felt like. Hobby wasn't the only kid at Brooklyn Science and Tech who'd never flown before. She shut the window shade against the endless white and settled back into her seat. The airplane pillow smelled weird, so she dropped it on the floor and scrunched up her sweater. With the steady roar of the plane in her ears, Molly could almost imagine falling asleep. In her dream, snow still rolled beneath the airplane, endless and empty. Molly could see everything now, not only through her little window, but in all directions. She saw the ice floes stirred by the ocean beneath them, pushed by the winds spinning around the globe. From up here, the forces that shaped the ice all made so much sense, like when she grasped the solution to an engineering problem. But there was something ahead that didn't make any sense at all. Out there in the snow, 100 miles away, something was waiting. Something that reminded Molly of her mother, a lonely, angry at fate, and a little confused. But it knew what it wanted. It reached out, grasping with lines of pure force for the airplane. A jolt went through Molly's body, along with a blazing white in her mind as bright as the snow outside. The thing out there in the ice, its claws were inside the plane now, slicing and cutting along the seams, setting those hundreds of miles of wire aflame, bending the course of the shuddering aircraft by sheer force of will. Then the blaze of its attention turned from the shell of metal and saw her, Molly Davis. It reached straight into her mind, lighting up her brain like it wanted to know her. Molly woke, gasping from the dream. But out here in the real world, things were just as bewildering. The cabin lights pulsed and flickered, and the plane was shuddering beneath her. Smoke filled the air. No way. She turned to Hobby. Am I awake? I sure am. His face was pale. 1 in 10 million, Molly thought. Those were the odds of a jetliner going down, according to her trivia book. She was about to say it out loud when the shriek of an alarm filled the cabin, and 500 oxygen masks suddenly tumbled from the ceiling. They danced and swung with the rocking of the airplane, like a chorus of horrible puppets, flailing among the light and smoke and noise. It was a rubber jungle, and everybody started screaming. Chapter 4. I'm going to get a quick drink. All right. An oxygen mask jumped and bounced like a living thing in front of Anna Klimak's face. She grabbed for it, her mind racing, trying to remember what to do next. To start the flow of oxygen, pull it toward yourself. Oxygen sounded like a good thing. Anna pulled the mask against her mouth and took a deep breath. It smelled like antiseptic and rubber, which was better than the acrid smoke that had woken her up. Her eyes stung and she could barely see. She held the mask against her face with one hand. Next to Anna, Mr. Keating was shouting something, but she couldn't understand him over the squeal of the alarm. The plane bucked beneath her, sending a jolt up her spine. She turned to Oliver. He was gripping his armrests, and his mouth was open in a scream she couldn't hear. With her free hand, she grabbed at his oxygen mask and pushed it into his face. He stared at it for a moment, like he didn't recognize it, but finally took it and held it to his mouth. His eyes were bright with tears, and Anna tried to smile to reassure him, but her face felt frozen, disconnected from her mind. What was she supposed to do now? She replayed the safety announcement in her mind, something about a crash position. Right, this was really happening. The plane was crashing. Something clicked inside Anna, and suddenly her fear was gone, replaced by questions. Does hitting the ground hurt? Or is it over too fast to feel anything? She almost found it comforting when this cold, emotionless part of her brain took over in emergencies, but her panic was rekindled by what happened next. A tearing sound filled the plane, a metal shriek from directly overhead, the ceiling splitting open. The great spine of overhead luggage compartments and lights and little air blowers lifted away, shattering into a million pieces of beige plastic as it rose. The oxygen mask was yanked free from her hand and went spinning into the sudden wind. No way, she breathed. Through the huge hole, a sudden white sky shone down on Anna, hard sunlight and snow-filled air. The wind was freezing, blustering at hundreds of miles an hour, forcing her smoke-stung eyes into a squint. Her ears popped so hard, her whole head felt like it was bursting. The Gale in the cabin reached into the seat back pockets to seize magazines and safety cards and boarding passes, churning them into a blizzard of paper that slapped at her face and hands. But a moment later, all that debris had fluttered up and away. Nothing was left but the snapped wires and shreds of plastic at the edges of the torn roof, trembling madly in the wind. The oddly rational part of Anna's brain wondered, how are we still flying? It seemed like the entire airplane should just surrender and fold up around her like something made of tinfoil. But somehow it was still slicing through the freezing air in a straight course, as if guided by a giant hand. And now something even weirder was happening. An electrical storm shot through the cabin, a 100-legged spider made of lightning that skittered from seat to seat. When it reached Anna, a buzzing filled her mind, along with pain as bright as the white sky. Her eyes slammed shut. She couldn't keep it out. The lightning crawled through her head, rummaging and pillaging. It felt like it was testing her, running 1,000 little logic problems through her mind. For a moment, Anna's brain almost seized up, but then the cold, unpanicked part of her took over, weirdly delighted to play along. When the lightning finally passed, it left her mind feeling scoured and bruised. She blinked her eyes and turned to Mr. Keating. What was that? But he wasn't there. Not even his seat was there. Just a jagged hole in the floor of the cabin. Wait, Anna started to say. The dazzling light swept past her again and wrapped itself around the man across the aisle. His whole body went into spasms, and from his mouth erupted a shriek that Anna could hear even over the roaring winds. The man's seat began to shudder, to bend and deform beneath him. Then all at once it tore itself from the cabin floor and lifted up, and both seat and man were flung out through the ceiling into the blinding white sky. No! Anna squeezed out through clenched teeth. This is a dream. It was a relief, the sudden certainty that this could not be happening. The lightning moved on down the lane, and Anna slammed closed her eyes against the blinding unreality of it. She tried to shut out the sounds of screams and tearing metal, the buffeting air that was too cold to breathe. She shut out everything. Putting her fists against her mouth, she screamed into them, wishing this all away. But the light and noise and freezing cold refused to fade. When Anna opened her eyes again, the cabin had almost been stripped bare of seats, but Javi and Molly were still there in front, and Oliver beside her. The weird lightning was gone, but the wind was just as wild. For a moment, Anna's eyes caught something through the cracked plastic of her window. A huge wall shimmered past, shining like a mirror, as if the sky was turning solid around them. But then white mist filled her window, and the sky above muddled into cloud. The freezing air grew damp. A crack came from beneath her. Then 1,000 shrieks shivered through the plane. Something was scraping along the bottom. Just in time, Anna remembered the announcement about crash positions and leaned her elbows back against the Javi seat. The plane jolted sickeningly as it hit the ground, then rocked from side to side in a long skidding stop. Stopping and snapping and ripping sounds filled her ears along the way. Finally, the airplane came to rest. The cabin floor tipped at a funhouse angle. She eased back against her seat and stared up through the torn roof. The sky was laced with leaves and branches. This last bit of weirdness somehow switched off the remaining shreds of panic inside Anna. There wasn't room for fear anymore. Suddenly she was watching everything from 1,000 miles away. Birds fluttered past, shrieking, upset that this giant metal thing had come crashing down into their forest. And from the depths of her strange calmness, Anna noticed that they didn't sound like any birds she'd ever heard before. To do next? To start the flow of oxygen.
I tried so hard. You got somebody. I can't do it.
An oxygen mask jumped and bounced. Why? Why? It's not funny.
Get with it,
Why?
girl.
Okay, we can edit this out.
You
You guys, why is this so funny?
I don't know. Okay.